Okay, today we're going to have a look at chapter 1 of Mice and Men. We're going to have a little plot summary, look at some characters, some key quotations, and we're going to start by having a look at the context. We're going to start by having a look at the context in which Of Mice and Men was written, so understanding what was going on in the world at the time and the influences upon Steinbeck. So we need to understand, in order to really get to grips with the novel, a little bit about the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and how this would have affected people like George and Lennie. So it started with the Great Depression, which was a worldwide economic depression starting in 1929 with the Wall Street crash and ending sort of late 30s and in some countries even into the 40s. And it was a time where people lost faith in the markets, the value of stocks fell, and personal income was often lost, meaning that the industries and the jobs that people had relied on in the cities just completely disappeared. So unemployment in the US, which is where we're focusing, rose to 25%, as a result of which many people left the cities and tried to find work in rural areas, working on the land. Now that's okay if there is work to be had, but this coincided with an event called the Dust Bowl, which was a period of severe dust storms caused by over-farming of the land and a drought, which meant that the topsoil in much of the fertile central regions of the US blew away. So people who had farmed land for years lost their homes, found themselves having to travel to find work, and you had this wave of what are known as itinerant labourers, which means people who are travelling from place to place just trying to find a job for a few weeks or a few months. When that job is done, they move on, and that is what George and Lennie are. It's a very lonely existence, and that is what Steinbeck was exploring when he wrote this book. Steinbeck was from California, where many of these itinerant labourers ended up. And he saw what life was like for these men, and he was moved to write about it because he was touched by how lonely and isolated they were and by the kind of stories they had to tell, even though they had really nobody to tell them to. So you could regard Steinbeck as the person who took those stories on and tried to tell the untold story of the itinerant workers. We're going to start by having a little look at a plot summary of section 1, where we first meet George and Lennie. And first of all, I'm going to have a look with you at the opening paragraph. Now, if you've got your text in front of you, which I'm sure you have, you'll notice that it starts in a very idyllic way. A few miles south of Soledad, the Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and green. The water is warm too, for it has slipped, twinkling over the yellow sands in the sunlight before reaching the narrow pool. So he's using lots of sibilants there, the repetition of the S sound to make it sound tranquil and flowing. He describes the beauty of it: willows fresh and green with every spring, mottled white recumbent limbs, sandy bank, we've got a little lizard. The idea that you can see all these track marks from animals, so it's a place where animals come and feel safe. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, why, Miss West, that sounds so much like a description of the Garden of Eden, you'd be just about right. It's an image of absolute perfection in nature. And of course, it remains that way and kind of isolated and splendid until George and Lennie turn up. And there's a brilliant quote: "For a moment, the place was lifeless, and then two men emerged from the path and came into the opening by the green pool." And those two men are George and Lennie. Now, I'm going to characterise today George and Lennie using fruit. So this avocado is going to represent George because he has a thin and bony nose, which I think you'll agree I've represented gloriously. He's small, he's sharp. This is kind of sharp, a bit knobbly. It's not maybe the best. And then I've used this mango to represent Lennie because it's kind of big and shapeless, and you can see the contrast between the two. We learn very quickly that George takes responsibility for Lennie all the time. It must be absolutely exhausting for him. So they are going on their way to the ranch to find work, and Lennie, bless him, has already forgotten what it's all about. And he says, "Where are we going, George?" George gets really cross. "So you forgot already, did you? I gotta tell you again, do I?" "Jesus Christ, you're a crazy bastard." This is a conversation they have a lot. Lennie just forgets stuff. He doesn't mean to. He can't help it. But it's George that has to take responsibility for everything. Lennie's quite childlike in that respect. And George also tells Lennie off when he is playing with his dead mouse. Lennie likes to pet soft things, and this is the first time that we find out about it. It foreshadows a lot of the disasters later in the novel, so it's very significant. But George, who's very sharp-eyed, clocks that Lenny is holding something, and he demands that he gives it to him. And Lenny says, "It's just a dead mouse, George. I didn't kill it. Honest, I found it dead." Now, he claims that he found it dead, but then later he tells us that, he goes to stroke them, and then they go to bite him, and so he pinches their heads, and then they're dead. So Lenny's idea of what is right and wrong, and what is dead and alive, and what represents a reasonable amount of force is obviously slightly awry. Anyway, then they settle down and they have a little conversation, and George says to Lenny, "And you ain't gonna do no bad things like you done in Weed, neither." And this is the first time we hear about Weed, and we don't know at this stage exactly what happened, but we know that Lenny gets up to no good. The interesting thing about Lenny is that he's so innocent and he's so naive that we know that he's not doing these things intentionally. But obviously, George is very worried about what's going to happen to Lenny. He also reminds him... Anyway, as I was saying before we were interrupted, he also reminds him that if anything bad should happen, he's got to go and hide in exactly the place where they are now. So he says to him, "If you just happen to get into any trouble like you always done before, I want you to come right here and hide in the brush. Just come here and hide in the brush." And he makes Lenny repeat it again and again and again. "Hide in the brush, hide in the brush." So that he remembers. And this is emphasized so much in chapter 1 that we know that this is going to be something which is significant. Again, using the technique of foreshadowing, this hints at future events, future disasters. Right. It's inevitable that with this great lump following him around all the time, George gets a little bit cross sometimes. And they have a bit of an argument over beans. George has got 3 tins of beans in his bindle, and he gets them out and he puts them on the fire, and there's Lenny, goes and gets the firewood, and they've got a nice little thing going on, and then Lenny goes and ruins it all. So we're not talking Heinz beans, but that's all we happen to have in the house. And so he's got, "I like my beans with ketchup." And George says, "Well, we ain't got no ketchup." And then he just repeats it again and again. "I'm just saying I like my beans with ketchup." Anyway, they have a little bit of a fallout about it. And George gets a bit stroppy and he says, "I could get along so easy and so nice if I didn't have you on my tail. I could live so easy and maybe have a girl." Ooh. Lenny doesn't know much about girls. And they have a little bit of a fallout, and he says, and Lenny goes, "I could go away and live in a cave, George." And George feels bad, so he's like, "You don't have to go and live in a cave." Anyway, it's all about beans and ketchup. And then they settle down and they're going to sleep, and Lenny asks George to tell him the story. He says, "Tell me, George, like you've done before." And George says, "Oh, God, Jesus Christ, I got to tell you again, do I?" And he starts to tell the story of the dream. Now, this, along with nature and friendship and loneliness, is another really important theme of the book. And he says, he starts to tell it, he says, "Guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world." And Lenny says, "But not us. And why? Because I got you to look after me, and you got me to look after you. And that's why." So this idea that they're different because they've got friends, because no one really had friends. They just did their own thing, did their job, moved on, found a new place. So the idea that it's a different world for them, and that they've got this plan. And George tells the story. He says, "Okay, someday we're going to get the jack together, and we're going to have a little house and a couple of acres and a cow and some pigs." And then Lenny breaks in, "And live off the fat of the land," Lenny shouted. And he starts to tell the story about how he's going to get to tend the rabbits, George, because he loves the rabbits, because they're a little bit like mice, but they don't get killed so easy. So they have this sort of sharing, and then eventually they lie down and they go to sleep. And the next day, they're heading off to the ranch.